co-founder of the PCCC, that is the Progressive Change Campaign Committee, Adam Green. Hello, Adam.
Hey, good to see you on this lovely morning.
Everybody's a little bit tired, but also like not feeling it in the way that we could have been feeling it.
Yeah, it's really a different world than we thought we would wake up to today. You know.
Let's start with that, okay? Yeah. Because at I don't know, at 6 p.m. last night, I have collected 10 statements that are already sort of like put out there by different organizations. You had Clyburn already out there getting interviewed saying like, we've got to do a reassessment, jumping the gun a little bit. Like they're all trying. And frankly, I bet you there was a lot of reporters and analysts who already had their template written. You had just even weeks ago, you had, Axios writing stories like The Third Way and, Carvel and, what's his face? I can't remember the other dude from, Paul Begala. Things are too radical with the Democrats and et cetera, et cetera. They've gone too far. And everybody had to toss those scripts, didn't they?
They did. And a lot of those scripts involved stabbing progressives in the back. They were ready.
Totally.
Win or lose, they want to stab progressives in the back. And the question is just, what will the terms be? And I think Third Way put out some big report that's completely moot at this point, assessing all the things that went wrong with Biden following progressives in a progressive direction. That was one of the big things I was worried about, where people basically saying, Biden, you went too far, you followed progressives too far, got to trim your sales, austerity, add in some woke politics stuff. And fortunately, a lot of those voices are mooted today. My starting point, just kind of assessing what just happened, is that democracy has another 2-year lease on life, right? We have 2 years where it looks like we'll have secretaries of state who can count the votes fairly and governors who will certify the elections fairly in most places, enough to survive in 2024. And we have a willingness by voters to show up for Democrats, to keep democracy and the priorities that happen in a functioning democracy moving forward, if we earn the opportunity in 2 years, right?
Let me just stop you there too, because I want to make sure that people understand we're having two conversations. We're having like the direct implications, the sort of like the material impact of these, and then we're going to be talking about sort of like the spin, which we're addressing, like where everybody's trying to sort of who's going to get blamed for this and how is it going to influence the direction of the Democrats over the next 2 years. But when you talk about democracy, and I've looked at the exit polling, and there was something like 30 or 40% of the voters. That was one of their biggest issues. I think that the two biggest issues were inflation and abortion, as far as I can tell. But protecting the democracy. But what does that mean? Like in practice, like when you say what are we actually saying when we say protect our democracy?
Yeah, I don't think it's any one bill or plank. It is. I think there was a gut level sense, especially among young people who showed up and voted Democratic, that fundamental rights were being taken away, whether it's the right to vote or the right to an abortion, or the right to exist on our planet. All these things are at stake. And just looking at some of the exit polls, young people, one of the biggest variables was would young people show up? They showed up, and by giant margins, they voted Democratic. Slightly older people barely voted Democratic, and then the two older age brackets voted Republican hardcore. And what that says to me is that they weren't voting for any one person. They weren't voting for Joe Biden or Joe Manchin, certainly. I'm not sure they were even voting for the Democratic Party as a brand. They were saying, we want our fundamental rights to stay intact. We want to keep saving the planet. We want Democrats to do more. And we're not stupid and enough to stay home. And I think that's one of the things about this election, is that it is partly a repudiation of the chattering class that thought that voters were too stupid to recognize that their democracy and their fundamental rights were being taken away. A chattering class that said this is just an election about gas prices, right? There was just something more swirling out there. And I think Democrats won despite the Democratic Party. not because of any kind of establishment message, really.
What I've seen from the exit polling is, I mean, the share of younger people was down a little bit relative to 2018. However, 18 to 29 was a 28-point margin in favor of Democrats. That's nuts. Like even like 65 and over is plus 13 for Republicans. And that's fairly static. I mean, that's, but to have almost a 30-point deficit between 18 and 29, and these people, that cohort of people, they're just going to vote in bigger numbers every year, right? Like as it just happens that, the older you get, the more you start to contemplate like, oh, the implications of who's in office actually is going to impact me and ultimately my kids and whatnot. But that's really stunning, I think. And there was also indication that people were voting because they're aware of, again, like you said, outside of the candidate that they may be voting for, they understood the implications of, it doesn't matter if I vote for Don Bolduc or, Michael Morris, they're going to vote the same way. That's a Republican. I am empowering the Republican Party, their entire agenda, regardless of what I think personally about a given candidate. And that I think is also an important sort of like, I guess, idea for Democrats to have in their heads, because I feel like Republicans have always been far more conscious of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I think there's kind of an existential scream that's happening, right? Again, do we have certain fundamental rights? Do we have a planet to survive on? When there are issues like gun violence in schools, do we have a democratic process where we can do something about it as a people? And I don't think it's any one of those issues. It is just this gut level sense that we need to not let these anti-democratic forces seize control of the entire machinery and government at this moment. So, I look to people like Maxwell Frost, the first Gen Z member just elected in Florida. And, he's way more the future than Joe Manchin, right? I think there's, whether we have 50 seats in the Senate or 51 or hopefully not 49, there will be some people like the Joe Manchins, like the Mark Warners, who might be arguing for austerity, for budget cuts. Like that is so not the mandate of this election, right? Again, if anything, it was saying, hey, Democrats, despite the fact that you took some steps in the right direction, but not enough, we're giving you the chance to go further the next 2 years. We want more action to save our democracy, our planet, our fundamental rights. For those who were saying we're talking too much about abortion, like do more to solidify these fundamental rights that we're depending on. The ballot measures showed it. Red states, blue states, purple states. Like Democrats won a lot, again, in spite of themselves. And again, this is a 2-year chance for Democrats to really get more done more quickly, as opposed to kind of being in this quagmire that Joe Manchin's had us in for the last couple of years.
And what's fascinating about it too is that it's way more disconnected from Joe Biden's approval rating than I feel like we've seen in the modern history of the country. Like it just this pushing back against the red wave. There's this NBC exit poll that I saw that Democrats won with voters who, quote, somewhat disapprove of Biden's performance as president, which is, it's an exit poll, take it with a lot of grains of salt. But the fact that there's that severance, I guess, or there's that division between those two factors is quite unique and speaks to what you're saying there, Adam, about how it's more about existential issues and rights than it is about, who's the charismatic figure at the top of the party.
Yeah. This hits on something I've been thinking about for about a decade, which is the difference between using proxies to do analysis versus just looking at the actual issues. To give one kind of, past example, I remember, Sam, we talked a lot during this time, during the public option fight, when that was kind of the left flank of the Obamacare debate. There was a New York Times poll that showed that 50% of Republican voters, 70% of independents, and 80% of Democrats wanted a publicly run insurance company to compete against private insurance. That same poll showed that 20% of voters call themselves liberal. And what the third ways of the world, the corporate Democrats of the world did was they said to the Democratic Party, hey, look, only 20% of the people are liberal. the public option is a liberal idea, so don't do the public option. And meanwhile, it's like, wait, do you not see the numbers right there? Like, there is a mandate for this, right? Now, thinking to the present and Joe Biden approval is a proxy for a certain direction, right? If you think about the dynamics here, there really weren't many issues where the Democratic Party writ large were running away from the direction Joe Biden was going, right? People weren't running away from the Inflation Reduction Act. They weren't running away from cancel student debt. They weren't running away from marijuana decriminalization. If anything, we had 90+% of the Democratic Party who wanted to go further on the economic side and further on the climate side that were stymied by Joe Manchin, and a lot of activists and people like us who, if we only somewhat approve of Biden, it's because we weren't able to achieve the full vision, right?
Right.
So if I were asked that question, I'd probably say like, yeah, somewhat approve or somewhat disapprove, but I'm still going to vote hardcore Democrat. I just think that that's the reality of where we are, and just looking at disapproval really is an attempt to marginalize those that want to go further, and hopefully the pundit class recognizes that.
Let's talk about the progressive losses in this election. There, as far as I can tell, there weren't any. I mean, you could argue that, Mandela Barnes is the only like progressive-ish candidate out there that has lost. I don't know if they've actually called that race yet, but I think they did. They did that. The Ron Johnson won, but hasn't been called yet. So it's still conceivable that he pulls it out, but also not terribly favored in that instance. Like, it's not everybody knew that was going to be a very, very, very difficult race, regardless of who was running in that race. But when we look at the losses, Sean Patrick Maloney in New York State. I mean, this is like, to the extent that there's any ideological lessons that can be taken from this. You look at what happened in places like, minimum wage approved in DC. We can go through these referendums. And that's what I like about like these sort of like referendums that we're starting to see. Oregon passes gun control measures. You got Maryland and Missouri legalizing weed. Now, Arkansas and North Dakota, not, but I mean, okay, Arkansas and North Dakota, but this is not, we're not talking about the center of like the political ideology. You look at what happened in Michigan, you look at South Dakota expanding Medicaid. When you leave this up to the voters, if you start to look at like the numbers here, by any definition on these key like referendums, the country is far more to the left on issues, right? Like on specific issues. Even in Nevada, it appears referendum 1 is going to pass. And that one explicitly says no discrimination, not just on race and religion and sexual orientation, but also gender orientation and the way that you represent yourself in terms of gender. And that's in Nevada. And so if you look at these things, broadly speaking, all of the, and on a local level, you're seeing prosecutors who are supporting reform. All of the direct sort of like you're saying, non-proxy votes would argue that this is a center-left country, at least.
Emma, do you agree?
I do. I'm sorry. I'm monitoring some of the races here, but yes, keep going.
So, but here's my question to you, I guess, Adam. How does that get communicated? Like, you're going out there, you're essentially like in an arena against the third way, right? Like, I mean, professionally, that's more or less what your job is to make sure that that potential candidates perceive and understand that the electorate is not as you're being told by the third way types who are all funded by billionaires, who ultimately want your agenda to be, they want your agenda to be less distributive ultimately. And they're couching it in the terms of like being more politically effective. How do you what's the mechanism in which you fight that?
Yeah, well, first, I do think that we all should point out that every single Democrat up and down the ballot, from school board to U.S. Senate, more progressive and more conservative, were swimming upstream and had a harder job this year because of Joe Manchin, Kristen Sinema, Josh Gottheimer, and the several renegade corporate Democrats that delayed the entire economic agenda from being passed as originally planned in summer of 2021, so that it would have impact on voters' lives by election day. There were frontliners who were not Progressive Caucus members out there complaining that we're trying to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, but that it hasn't been felt by people yet. And meanwhile, they are feeling gas prices, right? So again, luckily, we won despite some of those dynamics, but we just need to make very clear that anybody who does care about the politics of this should not be following Josh Gottheimer, Joe Manchin, Kristen Sinema, and the corporate aligned business roundtable types off the cliff. We need to go more the direction of Maxwell Frost and others who are actually generating enthusiasm. Second, we can point out that Maxwell Frost overperformed Val Demings and Charlie Crist in Florida. John Fetterman outperformed what Joe Biden did in Pennsylvania. The authentic populists are the ones who are generating more enthusiasm in apples to apples comparison against the corporate Democrats. And it's also worth noting that even among, again, the non-traditional Katie Porter, Pramila Jayapal types, Katie Porter, I was just looking to Emma, and she is ahead right now. Hopefully she'll win.
Right.
There are some really interesting frontliners like Jared Golden in Maine, who's kind of a quirky guy, isn't always with us on issues, but usually he's more economic populist than the party leadership wants him to be, and that's why he voted against Build Back Better, but came around for the Inflation Reduction Act when a lot of corporate giveaways were taken out. Angie Craig in Minnesota's 2nd District, she won a Trump district by 2 points in 2020. She came to PCCC candidate training back in 2016 and has been in the loop with us for a while. We don't talk to her every day, every week, but she was one of the main people rallying frontliners to push back against Josh Gottheimer when he was trying to delay the entire bill. And I remember she said to me several months ago, I'm probably going to lose my race. I have a worse district and only won by 2 points, and it's a worse year for Democrats. So I'm just going to campaign on my values. And she was hardcore against big pharma and against big corporate interests, and she won by about 5 points so far. And there's some really bright spots like that. Elaine Luria, one of our government relations people, pointed out to me today that all of the people that we've been working with to ban congressional insider trading of stocks, which our polling shows is actually a very high enthusiasm issue. It's both economic populist and anti-corruption, including Abigail Spanberger, who has actually been good on this issue, even though we disagree with her on some others. All of them won. Elaine Luria, who is being great on the January 6th committee, she's been one of the lead opponents of this stock insider trading bill to prevent it, and she lost. I'm not hanging her loss on that one thing, but if you just look at a gut level, are these people communicating an economic populist, of the people, anti-corruption vision on the ground? Those who are win, and those who aren't lose.
It's going to be interesting to see if there is a runoff in Georgia. I mean, hopefully, I would prefer, obviously, Warnock to get over 50 sooner rather than later. But if there is a runoff in Georgia, the last runoff in Georgia, I think, was largely responsible for the momentum going into the ARC, whatever it was, the big COVID relief bill. We didn't get the $2,000 checks, but we got the $1,400 checks. And they were using that in that runoff. I mean, you elect Ossoff and Warnock, and I'll get you $2,000 checks. It's going to be interesting to see if Warnock, he touched on the corporate greed aspect of the inflation that we're feeling. It's going to be interesting to see where the emphasis falls on that.
And if he goes way more negative on Warnock on Walker than he was in that first debate. I know he did it when he wasn't on stage, but when it comes down to just a mano a mano kind of race situation, maybe he actually hits him to his face on the lies about the abortion and then the payments and all that kind of stuff.
I suspect he's going to do that. But the real question is, how aggressive does he get in tying Walker to those issues of corporate greed and make it not just, can you trust Walker, but can you trust Mitch McConnell? Can you trust the Republican agenda that he subscribes to? I mean, that to me is going to be pretty telling. And so give me your sense of like, let's assume the AP just called it for Ron Johnson, sadly. God, jeez, so frustrating. At least I guess on some level, we got Evers there in Wisconsin, which is really important, both for 2024 and for the future of Wisconsin, broadly speaking. Okay, let's assume that we're in a situation where the Democrats retain control over the Senate. Republicans control the House by a couple of votes. What then? The legislative agenda is over, right? At that point. And, I guess there's some fights to be had in the lame duck in terms of what they do with the debt ceiling, et cetera, et cetera. But what then? What does your organization do? Obviously you continue to recruit candidates who are progressive, but what's the theory then in terms of like, what Biden should be doing?
Yeah. Welcome to our staff meeting this morning. We'll see. Our through line the last 2.5 years really has been keep the trains of democracy on track. That's why this cycle, unlike any other cycle, we were all in on Secretary of State races. And I do think we need to, look at the 2024 race, see is Donald Trump running or favored to win, and assess our Democratic nominee.
The answer is yes.
Well, we'll see. I mean, there might be a gut check after last night's election. I mean,
dude, seriously? How many times have we said the Republicans are really going to take a look at themselves?
Yeah.
I mean, they're all pretending that they can get rid of Donald Trump, but the fact is, no, they're going to fold like a house of cards. The moment Ron DeSantis has to actually go head to head with Donald Trump, it is over.
Like, are you seeing just really quickly these think pieces this morning about how big night for DeSantis? I mean, he did win, but he was running against Charlie Crist. So, but like huge win for DeSantis, massive losses for Trump, as if the candidates that Trump supports, the election deniers or whatever, are in any way indicative of how he'll perform when it's a Republican primary and he's the real deal on stage.
He's never been good.
It's just they're trying to will it into existence.
I mean, if we have this conversation next Wednesday, the day after he has announced, there's going to be there's going to be none of this. I mean, this is we are at peak DeSantis power right now. This is peak DeSantis power. It is the day after he's.
I managed to knock this conversation off with a sentence fragment. Sorry about that. Okay. Wasn't my prime point. My prime point was, we need to think seriously about 2024 and who has the best chance in 2024 of saving our democracy. Not just, starting with winning the presidential race, but also setting the tone for the entire landscape that will motivate voters again to actually show up so we don't lose democracy then. I think, again, we have a 2-year lease on life. That is one big consideration that is looming in the background before we get to the policy. When we get to the policy, we've been very encouraging of the White House and others picking a big fight with Republicans if they take the House majority on Social Security. Again, it worries me a lot that gas prices were the most tangible economic thing in people's lives recently. And a lot of this good stuff that we just passed has not taken effect yet. Social Security is another tangible thing in people's lives. And similar to the Obamacare fight, Americans don't want it taken away. And Mitch McConnell and others have signaled that they don't want to be playing on that turf. But too many Republicans have taken the bait and showed their true cards that they want to cut Social Security. So I think that would be, if our goal is to pick a fight quickly that Democrats can unify on, but that is on progressive grounds and just sets up the terms of debate for the lame duck Congress and for the next 2 years. I think starting with Social Security would be a really smart move by the White House. What that also does is it has ripple effects.
How do they do that? Like, what? How do they put up a bill to say expand Social Security? Is that? I mean, how do they do that?
So I think literally. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this. Literally, Joe Biden would start by giving a speech saying, let's be clear, Social Security and Medicare cuts should be off the table. I want to hear Kevin McCarthy or Republican leadership say that today, right? Send the whole press corps back to him. have a few other Republicans squeal and say, "Oh my gosh, why is Joe Biden saying this?" But yeah, Joe Biden should say, if anything, we should be expanding benefits to keep up with rising costs of our seniors. And I will say that we just this past week we took the rare step of commissioning 2 different pollsters to poll people for whom inflation was their top concern, and then I asked them, here's a set of things people think should be done to deal with rising costs. Which of these do you support and oppose? Cutting Social Security benefits was like 20-1 against among inflation voters. Increasing benefits for Social Security was like 15-1, yes, please. Taking on corporate price gouging was something like 10 or 15-1, right? So that's a really solid turf for us to be on. Cutting food stamps, hell no, right? But the Joe Manchins of the world, their instinct, and he signaled this past week, is to go back to austerity. And my question is, this is going really in the weeds, but if we do not increase the debt ceiling during the lame duck while we have power, assuming we don't keep it for the next Congress, that is setting up a giant fight around next August where Republicans will have extreme leverage and try to use it to cut whether it's food stamps or education.
Social Security.
Right.
Oh yeah, that's not terribly weedy. We've probably talked about that. I don't know, ad nauseum this week.
Right. So working backwards, if the question before Joe Manchin and the people like Mark Warner is, should we raise the debt ceiling $3 trillion just to get this fight out of the way? And it's just about wonky financial terms. Well, Joe Manchin's going to say, I can't explain this in West Virginia. We got to get our spending under control. But if we pick a fight like tomorrow on Social Security, and it's clear that the debt ceiling fight is a proxy in a good way for the debt for the Social Security fight, then the question for Joe Manchin is, can you go home and defend the fact that you're saving Social Security? There's a lot of older people in West Virginia. So honestly, I think that's where we start. And that just starts an entire ripple effect and chain of events, right? If we go the wrong way on that debt ceiling conversation, we're going the wrong way on a lot of policy issues. And there's too much oxygen in the room for the Joe Manchin types. If we relieve the pressure and can pick smart fights on our terms, then Americans who currently think Republicans absurdly are better on economics start realizing, oh, we're the ones fighting for workers. So I really think it all begins with picking a smart fight, and that puts oxygen in the room for winning future fights, or at least winning the public relations battle.
I want to follow up about the debt ceiling, but let me I also think, and when we talk about saving democracy, one of the things that you look at, like where what ends up eroding democracy, are things like gridlock. And it seems to me that the biggest benefit of the IRA was, and like you say, most of the benefits don't really phase in for a year, 2 years in some instances, and more. The biggest benefit was that there was a sense that our government was doing something. When Joe Biden relieved the debt, even though it's tied up by the Republicans in the court, there's a sense that our government is doing something. The idea that our government is not doing anything is one of the greatest contributors, I think, to the demise of democracy. If you look at like what just to go back to a pre-Nazi Germany, the idea of like gridlock there was what gets people to turn away from the polls and assume that there's no point in engaging in that democracy, and that's when things start to atrophy. So I think the executive action by Biden on a host of things as a surrogate, if you will, for a Congress that is probably going to be gridlocked over the next 2 years, I think is going to be really important. But in terms of the debt ceiling, you probably have a better sense of this than many. What is the conversations around that? Because when we talk about Joe Manchin can't go back to West Virginia and say like, I can't justify $3 trillion. Well, what if it was just like, we're just getting rid of the debt ceiling? Because that would require Joe Manchin to explain the debt ceiling anyways. You know what I mean? Like, how about this? We're not going to put a number on it. It's just going to go away because it doesn't make any sense. We've already spent the money. It's like, there's no, pay your bill day, essentially, that everybody has in their household. It's just like, yeah, you get the bill, you pay it because you've already spent the money. What are the conversations going on around that?
So don't want to get too far in the weeds, but a
Why?
good starting point is to recognize that according to Senate rules, because where it gets boring and very maddening, you can raise the debt ceiling through reconciliation, which requires 50 votes, but you can't eliminate it through 50 votes. So,
oh, all right. Well, that answers that question.
Yeah. And then, some people are being creative and saying, oh, we should raise it by the amount that Donald Trump's tax cuts cost. So like 1.5 trillion. Okay. That's a starting point. Again, the reason I say I don't want to get into it is because I think that we are on losing turf if we don't define it as a larger issue like Social Security. Again, like Joe Manchin should be voting on Social Security when it comes to the debt ceiling vote, not voting on some wonky procedure that we have to talk about reconciliation, right? I don't know if there's any predicting that guy, but I feel he actually, I will say, in one rare good moment in 2015, partnered with Elizabeth Warren to get an expand Social Security resolution voted on at 3 a.m. during one of these budget votoramas. And, it was a non-binding resolution. But as an organization that has been working with a few others, many of whom you two know, to push expansion of Social Security benefits, it took us 3 years to get to 7 senators. Yeah. And because Joe Manchin and Elizabeth Warren put that resolution in and it got a vote, literally overnight, we went from 7 to 42 senators for expanding benefits. I think that's because he knows that old people back in West Virginia care about Social Security. And that's why I think we are on better ground with him and should be with everybody if we redefine that fight. That's why I encourage the White House to pick a fight early on in Social Security.
Are there any old people in Florida who might be on Social Security? I mean, I don't know. It just seems like a no-brainer that should have been at the forefront. And look, I mean, I don't pretend to know the weeds of Val Deming's kind of campaign strategy, but I feel like we did not hear enough about that, especially when you have the 4 Republicans who would be taking over the budget committee saying they're going to hold that hostage. It seems like a clear message, but that was not communicated well.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know if you saw, but we did a video with FDR's grandson and great-granddaughter pretty much sounding the alarms on this. And his great-granddaughter pretty much said, we all thought that Roe wouldn't be repealed, and it did. That's a warning sign for Social Security. Like they're telling us what they're going to do. Get out there and vote, right?
I think that framing is very much underutilized, both as a political matter, but as just a point of reality. Like the idea of like, you give them power now. This isn't where playtime is over. This is like they're going to do all of it if they get the opportunity to do it, any of it. And I think that's important. All right, so we've talked a little bit about Joe Manchin. Let me just ask you one more question.
Yeah.
Kristen Sinema, if it's a 50-50 Senate, I mean, Joe Manchin has this sort of like long time sort of image that he's created for himself, this brand of like the Democrat who, there's very few things that Democrats stand for that he will support, on some level. But what do you think the danger of like a Kristen Sinema saying, Mark Kelly has won, let's assume he has. My whole strategy of being like the Democratic maverick may not work. Maybe it's better if I'm the Republican maverick. I mean, do you think there's a possibility she decides to flip parties? I mean, we've seen this, right? We saw it with Jeffords. We saw it with Specter. It went the proper way, but for us. But do you think it's possible that she could do that?
I mean, is it possible? Sure. Is it probable? I don't think so. And especially if we win the governor's race and Senate race in Arizona, that's a signal to her about the direction her state is taking. But that is a good prompt. Here's 3 reasons everybody should pray or hope for us to win both Senate seats in Nevada and Arizona. If we go into the Georgia Senate runoff with 50 votes in our pocket, it achieves 3 things. One, Kristen Sinema, one, Georgia voters who kind of held their nose and voted for Herschel Walker because control of the Senate was at stake might not vote or might not vote for him again, right? I talked directly to a pollster who's very involved in that race, and they said these people do not like Herschel Walker, but they're voting for larger control of the Senate reasons. So we take that off the table. If he wins, now we have 51 votes. What does that mean for Kristen Sinema? There's, it's 0% chance that she switches party because why would she, right? But going a step further, I hadn't really thought about it until now, but it's like, how do we get past the filibuster and, all this mantra of we need 2 more votes, we need 2 more votes. Right now, the ceiling is 1 more vote, right? Well, she's up in 2024, and likely Ruben Gallego will be primarying her, and she's going to face a lot more pressure. So there is a bank shot scenario where we have John Fetterman there, and on select votes we can pressure her when she's running for her political life. So let's all of that breaks down if we lose either Nevada or Arizona in the Senate. So we'll see.
Let me ask you one more question. Do you think Fetterman in the Senate influences Manchin at all? I mean, because when I think about sort of who Manchin thinks his audience is, right? I mean, I think it's like a couple of coal barons and, the guy who's going to hire his daughter, et cetera, et cetera. But in terms of like his voter, like Fetterman, it seems to me, is the archetype of that type of West Virginia voter. I mean, or at least in a way he presents, and maybe it's affectation, but also from a politics standpoint. I mean, he cleaned up in a lot of different areas that we haven't seen Democrats perform terribly well in. And I want I'm just asking, not even theorizing so much as in your experience, could a candidate who comes in next door state, influence, provide some oxygen or some pivot moving for Manchin like that?
Yeah, I have been very hopeful for this exact scenario. I don't know if we all have favorite John Fetterman tweets in our head, but my favorite tweet was during the primary, right during the voting rights fight, when the filibuster was in the center of the national news and Joe Manchin was pretty much saying the people of West Virginia want me to keep the filibuster. Fetterman was campaigning in a portion of rural Pennsylvania, and he tweeted out that he was right along the West Virginia border, that the community is very much the same. And he's like, surprise, surprise, nobody in my town hall meeting asked me to support the filibuster, right? And that was a direct shot at Joe Manchin. Now, it's easier to say that on Twitter than in the middle of a Democratic caucus meeting. But one thing that I've been a little bit chagrined about is that I think that a lot of Democratic senators, even our heroes, are a little bit too polite to Joe Manchin behind the scenes. They give him way too much breathing room. I think John Tester is the person who would probably have the most standing right now to do exactly what you're saying. But the Bernies, the Elizabeths, I don't get the sense that they're telling off Joe Manchin behind the scenes. John Fetterman could. I don't know if he will, but I feel like he will have the highest probability of just calling out ridiculous lies that Joe Manchin is peddling and not having the politeness that sometimes insider culture promotes. So I'm hopeful for that. We'll see.
Do you have a sense of in these caucus rooms, if John Fetterman says something, are there half a dozen senators who go I tend to believe it, as opposed to let's say Elizabeth Warren saying it? It's hard, I think, for us to sort of imagine that there's that kind of dynamic
in the Senate.
But if the 6'5" guy who looks like he's just walked off a construction site goes, that guy's talking bullshit because I know the people who live in that area. Are there other senators who go, well, maybe he is talking bullshit?
Yeah, I think he will have unique credibility in the caucus, if that's what you're asking. And he'll have super.
Yes, that's what I was asking. Yeah,
okay,
yes, that's what I was
asking. He also will be the hero of this election cycle, right? He will come in to wild applause his first caucus meeting, right? Persevering through his stroke, picking up a seat. If we're at 51 votes, or if we keep the Senate, he will be a hero, and what he says will have outsized influence. He will stand for the mandate of this election more so than Joe Manchin, who did nothing this election except get in the way, right? So yeah. I think the answer is yes.
It's also the difference between, say, Bernie and Warren commenting on this. They share a border, right? I mean, in Pennsylvania and West Virginia.
Yeah,
so is that what you're saying?
Yeah,
Sorry.
Yeah,
we were up late last night, so I'm a little slow today.
Well,
yeah, there are affinity groups. There are blocks of people that listen to each other, and Warren, Bernie, Jeff Merkley, Sheldon Whitehouse, several others are seen as a little bit more predictable coming up on the progressive side. That's why it's valuable to have a John Tester, who himself I think is a prairie populist, and John Fetterman, who will be even better in there. Can we just say one more thing about executive power before we wrap up?
Yes, please.
Because the governing agenda, one thing that has gotten pretty much zero coverage is the impact of Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema and Josh Gottheimer, et cetera, delaying the economic agenda for a year on the use of executive power, right? I think the fact that cancel student debt happened within 2 weeks of the Inflation Reduction Act passing was not an accident. It was, right? They were waiting for his vote and didn't want to spook him.
Absolutely. I think that was absolutely true. I mean, I got to say, look, I also believe that the Biden administration screwed up back in May, essentially, of 2021 when they invited the Republicans in and then they allowed Cinema and Portman. But yes, it was quite obvious they could not start doing things that Joe Manchin would consider controversial until that vote was done.
Right. So there's more of that. I mean, we have not maxed out executive power in the first 2 terms. I am very hopeful that people like Lena Khan at the FTC and Rohit Chopra at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, can now get going on the super popular stuff. There are 90-10 issues. So to give one example, one issue before the FTC, did you know that Burger King workers and McDonald's workers have to sign a non-compete clause when they take their jobs?
What?
So should they want to ask for a $1 raise and say, I'm leaving McDonald's, I'm going to Burger King? They cannot, right? Because of these things. Well, that's something that would resonate on a non-ideological level with people all across the country. There's many issues like that. We need to take on the airline industry. We need to take on Wall Street more, the banks, right? Rohit Chopra is taking on these junk fees, right? I write you a bad check, you cash it, you get a fee from your bank. Why? Because they can. There's all sorts of things like that are just silly issues of corporate greed and cheating that we can take on and reclaim the mantle of economic populism so that people no longer say they trust Republicans more in the economy. So I do think that, to your question, 10 minutes ago, what will the collective we focus on? That has to be a part of it. I think we need to pick smart fights with Congress and stake our flag on economic populist issues like Social Security. But there's a lot more we can do and celebrate and amplify when it comes to executive power, especially with economic populist stuff.
Adam Green, aside from the fact that sometimes it takes 10 minutes to answer my question, it was a pleasure to have you today. Honestly, it's always great to get insight into, sort of like how that part of influencing politicians works. And so let's hope that the Biden administration takes up Social Security, and that can become the sort of like, I guess, the fight in which sweeps up and it takes the debt ceiling off the table, as it were. Adam Green, PCCC, folks can find it at boldprogressives.org. Is that it?
That's correct. Thank you both.
Thanks so much, Adam.
Bye-bye.